Of the 100 leading companies listed on Britain's stock exchange, 98 avoid paying tax by using offshore tax havens. Is that fair? Or is it one set of rules for the corporate elite and another for the rest of us? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. The tax burden on Britain's poor is increasing, yet banks here in the City of London can legally avoid to pay tax. Well, before we find out what the people think here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
During a visit to Pakistan in April, British Prime Minister David Cameron told well-off Pakistanis that too few of them are paying tax. Too many of your richest people are getting away without paying much tax at all, and that's not fair, he told them. He added that Pakistan was simply not raising the resources necessary for paying for things that a modern state and people require. The Prime Minister's comments come at a time when the gap between the rich and poor in the UK is getting wider and social services are facing severe cuts. More significantly, the City of London is home to a whole network of tax-exempt elite, businessmen and corporations who invest in the city to make profit and take advantage of the legal loopholes in the UK tax system. Offshore banking and tax havens feed billions in business to the City of London, whose financial services and high level of secrecy bring business into London that otherwise would not come, according to the City of London Corporation. Research by the global development charity ActionAid has revealed that all but two of the UK's wealthiest companies have overseas subsidiaries located in tax havens, amounting to over 8,000 companies that avoid paying tax in the UK. The biggest users of offshore finance are banks and the financial corporations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Meanwhile, the Conservative government has said that it wants to create the most competitive tax system in the G20 and is proposing new reform measures to drive private sector growth. But if the reforms go ahead, big businesses will be completely exempt from paying tax on foreign income and enjoy the lowest corporate tax rate of any major Western economy. The Trades Union Congress estimates conservatively that a total of £25 billion is lost annually to tax avoidance. And while the government has announced a crackdown on collecting overdue taxes and closing tax loopholes, it remains unclear whether it will affect the right people and bring the right kind of change to the British economy.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began by asking what people knew about tax avoidance.
Tax avoidance is, well, anyone, but basically the very rich pay their accountants so they don't have to pay taxes, so they can avoid their social responsibilities.
Well, doing their best to avoid paying what is their kind of duty to pay.
What do you know about tax avoidance?
Basically, I know that it's a thing that banks do to evade paying tax legally.
Tax avoidance is avoiding paying taxes in whichever area it may be applicable.
Not paying your fair dues.
Basically, firms avoiding paying tax using different methods of, offshore or other ways.
I don't really know a right lot, but I try to avoid tax as much as possible. But if you have a good accountant, apparently it's all right. So I've got quite a good accountant, so I don't pay much.
Tax avoidance is where companies use mostly sort of complex ways of either setting up offshore companies or front companies to not pay the tax that they are supposed to pay, basically, legally.
Do you know what tax avoidance as opposed to tax evasion is?
I assume it's knowing what taxes you should pay, but trying to find loopholes not to pay them.
Tax avoidance is like avoiding taxes to not give the government money so that they don't spend it badly.
I know there's a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. I think avoidance is the legal one, is it? And evasion is illegal. So it's finding ways of paying less tax, but without actually breaking the law.
Different views there from the public. Let's find out now what our experts think.
Tax avoidance is essentially the practice of very wealthy individuals and corporations who use very expensive accountants to essentially exploit the tax system and find loopholes in which to reduce or avoid their tax bill. And obviously this is a huge problem here in the UK, particularly given the huge budget deficit and the fact that here in the UK the government is cutting public spending by up to £80 billion over the next few years. It should also be said that there is also, of course, a problem with tax evasion, and that is the illegal practice of companies and individuals who actually evade paying their taxes through offshore bank accounts and all the rest of it. In terms of the figures, it's believed that the tax gap in the UK comprises of around £70 billion in tax evasion, around £25 billion in tax avoidance, and another £25 billion in uncollected tax. So, you know, these are big figures, particularly when you take into consideration the fact that the government is cutting public spending by £80 billion.
We have to distinguish people doing something that's legal from something that's illegal. When it comes to people arranging their fares so that they pay the least possible tax, then again there are different situations. We have one which is very much contemplated by the politicians. They want you to do a certain thing and they'll give you a tax break. A different situation is one where people take advantage of that rule in an unexpected way, and the question is how far that should be allowed. In terms of the repercussions, well, obviously if people break the rules, then the state ends up collecting less tax than it expects. Perhaps it knows that people are going to break the rules to a certain extent, and maybe it calculates that. On the other hand, in terms of legal tax avoidance, well, maybe more tax is collected and maybe less. It may be that that tax break is there in order to encourage certain kinds of activities, boost the economy. When you're coming to the kind of situation where it's unexpected, using it in an unusual way that wasn't contemplated, then you may very well find that people pay less tax than you expected to collect.
As we've heard, Goldman Sachs had a £10 million tax bill written off last year. How was this rich investment bank allowed to get away with it? And what about David Cameron's remarks that Pakistan's rich elite were not paying enough tax? Double standards, perhaps? Let's find out what the people think.
You know, so I'm sure that the Goldman Sachs pales into insignificance compared to the debt of a whole country. Yes, of course, I am against it. And what they're probably thinking is, well, if Goldman Sachs go down, then everybody else is going to go down like a pack of dominoes with them. You know, some people are saying that may not be such a bad thing. But we've learned over the last few weeks, months, that we cannot foresee the consequences.
Because supposedly they're a big bank. I'm sure they've got their fingers in many pies. I'm sure they know plenty of government officials, and there's lots of things going on behind closed doors that we don't know about.
Last year, Goldman Sachs had a £10 million tax bill written off by the tax authorities. How do these large investment banks get away with it, in your view?
They have clever accountants and solicitors that seem to get them off.
Yeah, they're all part of this. It's all part of the same boat boys networks. The people who run the CPS, the people who run the HMRC, the people who run the government now. They're all part of the old same. I mean, it's not necessarily as it was back 100 years ago with top hat and old school tie club, but it's still exactly the same thing. They know each other. They're all friends.
I don't know if they should. Of course, it's not right. They've done it. I don't know what can be done about it now. I'm not a lawyer or anything, but that's just not right.
Well, quite easily. They have a lot of influence. You know, the world's very different to what it was 50 years ago.
No, I mean, they're very powerful companies with lots of money that they do pay in taxes, and that's the problem, that the HMRC might think, well, we'll lose 10 million here, but if we really clamp down on them, they'll go somewhere else and we'll lose even more. So
probably because they're such a large, powerful company, and I guess that's how they got away with it.
Well, they're very sneaky, and I think they should have been in trouble for that.
Last year, Goldman Sachs, it's a wealthy New York investment bank, had £10 million of tax written off by the authorities. How can they get away with that, do you think?
I imagine through, well-paid lawyers. I imagine it's as simple as that.
I don't know the detail of it. It's very difficult for me to comment, but it's not surprising. These are big commercial transactions.
It is not very sort of clean deal, obviously, in my mind, but it's probably better than nothing.
Last year, David Cameron went to Pakistan and said that Pakistan's elite don't pay enough tax to provide enough services to the people of Pakistan. Is that a bit rich, as it were, given what's happening in Britain?
I think it's a different system there because there's a bigger gap, I imagine, between rich and poor, where there's a lot more middle-class people here paying taxes, so the gap isn't quite so dramatic.
Sounds like it's a bit rich coming from David Cameron. But I don't know the details of it, the ins and outs. I mean, it's easy for us to point the fingers at other southern European countries where tax avoidance is part of the culture. It's easy for us to do that without knowing, they feel that they don't get much back from paying their taxes, and so, it's just it's a cultural thing for us. Yeah, it's different sets of standards.
If they're willing to write off all that debt for Goldman Sachs, then he doesn't really have a right to say that, I guess, because you're just picking and choosing who should pay, who shouldn't then. So, no, I think everyone should be paying their fair dues. So
Depends where he's having that conversation. I mean, you can include Pakistan, you can include a lot of the countries in the world. Look at the Greeks, they don't even want to pay a minimum amount of tax. It's complete abuse of power. But look, these things happen in all countries.
I think it's different in Pakistan. Over here you get everything for free, and in Pakistan they don't get anything. Even if they do pay taxes, they don't get much. They won't be able to make enough of a living anyway, so I think it's fair dues for them. Over here it's a completely different story.
Absolutely. David Cameron is a complete liar, basically. He says anything just to... he's a complete hypocrite, like most politicians.
David Cameron was in Pakistan earlier this year, and he told the elite in Pakistan they needed to pay more tax. Do you think he's being a bit hypocritical when many of the world's richest come to Britain to avoid paying tax?
The Pakistan with the cricket this week and everything is a bit controversial at the moment with me, so I think it is a bit hypocritical, yes. Yes, I do, yes.
I don't know the details of that story, but yeah, I think it's a pretty... It sounds like we're being unfair, but I'd have to know the details to really comment on that one.
It's hypocritical. It's playing to the audience back home. He's playing we're the civilised country. We're telling these poor little coloured countries how to behave.
Well, those are the views of the people here on the streets of London. Let's find out what our experts think.
I think there is certainly some sense of there being double standards here, and certainly David Cameron does need to do an awful lot more to crack down on tax avoidance and evasion in the UK, given some of the figures that I quoted earlier. However, I suppose if you sort of look at it from a sort of reasonable perspective, I think, some of the problems faced in Pakistan are an awful lot, worse and an awful lot more extreme in terms of some of the practices that are taking place in Pakistan. And I suppose, if you look at it from that perspective, given how pervasive the problem is in Pakistan, maybe, David Cameron does have at least a bit of a point there in what he's making, but does it come across a little bit as the sort of the pot calling the kettle black? Then yes, absolutely, and David Cameron does need to do an awful lot more, not just to be talking about rhetoric about clamping down on tax avoidance, but actually, showing concrete action here in the UK. And that's why it's absolutely important that we do employ more staff at HMRC to investigate some of these tax problems. It's why we do need to clamp down on a lot of these tax loopholes, and that the government really does take this issue a lot more seriously.
Of course, we all can agree that we want a fair tax system. That's easy. It's like virtue or happiness. The question is how to get it. And most countries, most states, compete with other states in order to attract wealthy individuals. So it's like any other competition in business. The question is, do we get a bit high and mighty about it at times which are economically stressed? Now the whole issue of tax avoidance has become very live because the economy isn't going too well and the government is short of money. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we still have to do what's most efficient in order to gather the most tax. And at the same time, we mustn't forget about fairness when people are suffering. It's a balance. If we're thinking about how we can collect the most amount of tax, then there's strong evidence to suggest that having lower tax rates and more generous rules means that people don't go to such a lot of trouble to try and avoid it. That's certainly what Ronald Reagan found in the 1980s, and also Mrs. Thatcher when she lowered the tax rates. A great deal more tax was collected. People were quite anxious about what would happen. So, ironically, I think, now that times are tough, we should be very, very careful about trying to raise tax rates, and that's one of the things that the coalition is struggling with, because people intuitively know that many wealthy or talented people are leaving the country or not coming to it because of the very high rates of tax of 50p, which are, of course, if you ask anyone, do they want to give half of what they have away, they're not going to be very comfortable with it. At 40% or 45%, like in other countries, it's psychologically different. But at the same time, of course, one can understand the dilemma the politicians are in, because it doesn't seem fair that the wealthiest should, in fact, not bear more of the burden when they have so much more.
So 98% of Britain's leading companies avoid paying tax by using offshore havens. Should this form of tax avoidance be made illegal? And will the government's clamp down on tax payments actually help the UK economy? Or will they only clamp down on those they can catch, leaving the leading financial institutions to carry on doing as they please?
It doesn't really surprise me, which shows that that's kind of a sad thing. I'm not sure what should be done. I mean, there should be more restrictions on where you can do your financial transactions. For example, if you're incorporated in Britain, then you should be keeping all your taxable transactions here.
I think it's okay, as long as a certain amount of tax going into going to be used for the people of this country.
98% of Britain's leading companies avoid paying tax by using offshore tax havens. Does that surprise you that it's so high, and what should be done about that?
It really is. I mean, they're using all these loopholes, and really, it's they've got to close this up. It's been going on for years and years.
It doesn't shock me. I mean, if there are legal ways to do it, you can't really blame them for doing it. I think all the loopholes that exist, it's the government's duty to close those. I think it's an absolute scandal that they exist.
Well, that's not right, is it? So the taxman needs to get on that.
I'm surprised that it's that percentage. And why should they be able to avoid paying tax if they're working in this country and employing people in this country?
No, it doesn't shock me. It doesn't shock me. It's more the fact that I think it's fair dues, really. I mean, I'm trying to start up a small business into a big business. And if I could ever get as much money as possible, I'd do the same.
I think it's really bad. I think it's dangerous. The current situation that we're in with the cuts.
98 out of the 100 leading companies on the FTSE have offshore accounts, and they avoid paying the tax that they would otherwise need to pay. Should that be made illegal?
No, I do. I think it should be made illegal. Definitely.
because we're losing money for the country.
To be honest, no, it will not surprise me at all. I told you, everything is like big companies, they hide in a lot of stuff, and then you're wondering how this company is successful.
Doesn't sound like it's right, because they earn so much money, they should probably pay their taxes.
The government says it's going to clamp down on tax payments, but do you feel that they may only catch those that they can, often middle and lower income levels, rather than the international sort of banking and financial sectors?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a fear that I would have. I would hope that they would go straight to the top. But again, there's that link between big business and the Tory party, in my mind anyway. I don't think that we should be spending a huge amount of time chasing small-scale stuff, because the problem is, as I see it, is really at the top.
Yeah, I think it's going to help. But from my small understanding of what's going on, it seems like we're still going to face a double dip, and when there's not going to be much we can do about that now.
This government won't, no. Yes, I mean, clearly it's the people at the top, it's the big bankers who screwed up the economy, not me, for example. On my wages, have got, my income, I'm making 2/3 of what I was 5 years ago.
Difficult to say. Depends how they want to go about it. There's like I said, there'll always be those that abuse the system if they can, but it depends. It's very important that the government gets it right. So the last thing you want is them chasing. There are certain people in this environment that maybe are cutting corners, not paying the amount of tax that they should, but out of necessity, as opposed to Goldman Sachs, like you said, that avoided £10 billion worth of tax payments last year.
Personally, I don't think there's a financial crisis. I think it's all made up. I started my own company when it just started, and since then I've gone from strength to strength. So I've seen nothing about any sort of financial crisis. So what to do with that, it's sort of beyond me. I think everybody uses it as an excuse, especially in this country. They use it all as an excuse.
No, I think that's a long haul, and that's a big mess that, nothing's going to sort that out in a short while, especially, cutting down on taxes.
The government is now saying it's going to clamp down on its tax payments. Do you think that at the end of the day, though, they'll only get, perhaps the middle, the less well-off who are avoiding tax, rather than the international banking elite that they basically will allow to carry on doing as they please?
I think we just have to wait and see. I hope they manage to clamp down, but we just have to wait and see.
Well, in my opinion, I think the Robin Hood tax, the Tobin tax, something like that would be quite effective, and closing the little loopholes. But the policies these people come out with, they tend to be hurting the little man, don't they? That's how you get an article in the Daily Mail. That isn't how you solve the financial crisis.
I do know that they've been targeting plumbers, and now they're going to target teachers. So, as ever, they're going after the small fry.
Well, we've run out of time now. Thank you for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.